The Crypto Markets Update is brought to you by KuCoin, the best place to find the next crypto gem.
All right, joining us now to discuss further on the crypto markets is Henri Arslanian, Global Crypto Lead at professional services firm PwC. Hello there, Henri. Always a pleasure to have you on. So I wanted to have your reaction to Fed Chair Jerome Powell's hearing. Amid this context that the Wall Street Journal has just released this article that 2021 is expected to rank as the biggest year for inflation in 4 decades. So what were some of your top takeaways?
Absolutely, Christine. Great to be back and great to have you, Lawrence and Emily, as well. I think it's obviously a very interesting time. As Emily just mentioned, this could be the eureka moment that a lot of the crypto community has been looking at the intersection of, as whether Bitcoin can be a hedge against inflation. I would argue, obviously, the pullback that we had in the last couple of weeks is very likely linked to some of the expectation for the market that the Fed may pull back on some of the COVID era stimulus that they had in mind. But I think it's going to be very interesting to watch over the next couple weeks or months of what's going to happen from that perspective of when it comes to especially with the latest CPI data that just came out this morning.
Henri, looking at some of your predictions for 2022, one of them included decentralized exchanges taking off. How do you see it in perspective of what the Fed is doing now, and which decentralized exchanges do you think are going to do well this coming year?
Yeah. No, I think, Lawrence, when we look at the world of DeFi, as we all know, it's obviously has grown tremendously in the last couple of months. I mean, we had less than 20 billion in total value locked at the beginning of 2021 to over 100 billion today. I think the one thing that I'm watching is I don't think the evolution of DeFi will have nothing to do with what the Fed is doing, with the CPI numbers are. I think it's just a natural evolution of the industry. Obviously, from all the verticals of DeFi, from lending to DEXs to even the insurance or asset management, definitely DEXs are the ones that I'm watching. Today, there's about $100 billion in volumes on a monthly basis on decentralized exchanges. I expect that to continue to increase, just not only because more and more people get comfortable with DeFi, but also because a lot of these platforms are becoming more easy to use, and that can bring in an on-ramp of new users.
So does anything change though with higher inflation for them in terms of the people chasing yields?
I think that could be one thing to look at, but I actually believe that a lot of the level where we are right now when it comes to DeFi is obviously there's a big chunk of the users of DeFi are crypto natives, or people are very comfortable with crypto. I still think that as a hedge against inflation, a lot of the mass market who will enter crypto will do it via centralized exchanges at first. Platforms that are B2C, easy to use, where people can buy Bitcoin with the click of a button, or even some of the institutions who are enter the space who are likely to do it via centralized intermediaries at first. Let's not forget, often centralized intermediaries, whether we like it or not, are the 1.0 for an entry point for a lot of these investors and users, and it takes some steps before they get into DeFi.
Henri, another interesting thing that came up in the hearing yesterday was somebody asked Powell where this report was on the U.S. central bank digital currency that they've been talking about forever. And he said, it'll come any day now, but it'll probably raise more questions than it answers. Meanwhile, in China, that's not the case at all. The Beijing Olympics are coming, and we're going to see the CBDC kind of really go into effect. And that was one of your predictions also for 2022 that we're going to. So could you just talk to us a little bit outside of the fact that we're going to see it at the Beijing Olympics? Like, what is going to be the impact of China's CBDC on the world?
100%. I think there's the 2022 will be a big year on the CBDC front. Of course, last year we had many developments on the wholesale CBDC side, like from Enbridge, done from Hong Kong, to Dumber from Singapore, to again a lot of more advanced developments on the retail CBDC from Nigeria to the Bahamas, for example. I think all eyes will be on China. I mean, to put things in perspective, Emily, in the last year, there was over $9.7 billion in ECNY, the Chinese retail CBDC, that was used. There were, according to the last official data, over 140 million Chinese who had an ECNY wallet. Actually, according to some media reports last week, the ECNY was the most downloaded app on the App Store in China. I think this is going to have a lot of impact. I wouldn't say necessarily act as a catalyst for other central banks, but would definitely be an area of attention. There'll be a lot of eyes will be on it, not only from other central banks, but also organizations like the BIS, for example.
Yeah. Meanwhile,
can you just tell us a little bit about what the more sort of with the more practical, like, everything you're saying, and these are all great data points, but like, what will actually be the impact though, inside China, because, okay, a lot of people are downloading it, it would be great for you to tease it out a little bit about what the actual impact will be, even if not internationally, then domestically.
I think initially the impact we should expect is really domestic. I think although the PBOC has made it very clear that technically the CNY can work internationally, there is no intention, at least officially now, to bring this overseas. I think on a day-to-day perspective in China, it won't really matter that much because already China is pretty much cashless. Everybody's using digital payments, but instead of using, let's say, the traditional rails of the WeChat and Alipay, let's say they'll be using a CNY. Where this can have a debate, I think, on a global level is on a couple of issues. One is on the issue of programmability of money, because now we can see it into force. Privacy. And what can be the impact? And third is data basically from a monetary policy perspective, better visibility on the economic activity in a country. I think these are data points that because of ECNY, the PBOC will have better color. And I think while it may not impact day-to-day the user, I think this has pretty big interesting impact and benefits for policymakers that will be very interesting for other policymakers around the world.
Yeah. And while China is developing this, at the Federal Reserve level, they're just about to release the digital currency report, so a little bit behind. But in any event, I wanted to circle around back to inflation. We have a CoinDesk article out now that U.S. inflation, the rate has risen to a 4-decade high of 7% in December. I wonder your comments on that and the impact it may have on the crypto markets.
Absolutely. I think, Christine, I think the pullback that we saw in the last couple of weeks, many would argue is linked to that, actually. I would argue that actually many would see in the crypto community, and frankly, a lot of investors who have been sitting on the sidelines will see some of the events we saw in recent weeks as a buying opportunity. We saw some of the impact on the price of Bitcoin in the last 24, 48 hours. And I think that's what I would expect for many investors who are on the sideline. They will see this as a buying opportunity. Again, let's not forget there's a lot of structural reasons to be bullish on Bitcoin, from the entry of institutional players to the crypto industry becoming more institutionalized, to even other topics like, for example, the ease of retail to buy and even regulatory clarity. And I think when you look at all these factors, there's very good reasons to be actually optimistic on not only the growth of Bitcoin, by the way, but also the growth of the crypto markets more generally. And I think what some of the market impact that we saw will be beneficial, will be a kind of a signal for many of those who are waiting on the sidelines to jump back in.
Yeah, Henri, there's been and I've asked a few guests now about this, but perhaps I don't know if you got a chance to read it. Moxie Marlingspike from Signal, the founder of Signal, had a critique of Web3, saying basically it's far more centralized than people realize, in many ways echoing some of the criticisms that Jack Dorsey had, et cetera. And you're kind of seeing this pushback against Web3 being not what it's being advertised as. What's your take on that? Do you think that that the market will push back a bit on it, or is it inevitable? What do you think is going to happen this year?
Absolutely, Lawrence. I think the movement towards Web 3.0 is going to happen, whether we like it or not. The question is not a question of if, but how many years it's going to take us to move to a Web 2.0 decentralized ecosystem. I think it's very natural that as we transition from Web 2.0 to Web 3.0, there is kind of a transition that takes place, and centralized intermediaries will still play a role in it. In the same way, by the way, when we talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, which are completely decentralized, many people we're stepping into the space using centralized intermediaries. So I think it's very likely, very natural that the evolution from Web 2.0 to 3.0 takes place again with a certain role to be played by some of these centralized intermediaries that we know today, and some of them that will be created over the next couple of months and years.
Henri, we just flashed an article that you wrote for CoinDesk on your 2022 predictions. So last year we saw NFTs, layer ones like Solana and layer twos like Polygon really take off. I wonder what protocols you see taking off this year, or what crypto subsector?
I think for the coming year, I'm watching a lot. Obviously, not only let's focus on the layer ones to start. I'm watching a lot of the layer ones and see how the evolution of the various ecosystems will take place. I think the big element to watch here is also what's going to happen to Ethereum. Let's not forget in the previous bull markets. Let's take 2017 for example. Ethereum was the only show in town, and right now, obviously, there's numerous other layer ones from Avalanche to Algorand to Tezos to Solana and many others that you mentioned, where there's actually very good competition. I think for me, one thing I'll be watching in 2022 is where there's more traction. Where are these users, when they're starting NFTs, for example, which platforms they're using. Today, Ethereum has over 90% of the NFT market. Where is that activity going to migrate? And these are some of the things I'll be watching over the next couple of months. I think there's a lot of potential winners of other layer ones, for example. I think this is going to be a very important year for Ethereum, a kind of a make or break year, because obviously I think there's a lot of frustration, as we all know, within the community on the fees, for example, that went from $4 to almost $70 last year. And I think this year, if the Ethereum 2.0 and some of the changes that have been put on the roadmap do not happen, I think some users may decide that the grass may be greener outside.
Now, you mentioned in that same piece, you were talking about countries that are adopting Bitcoin, or El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as a reserve currency, as a official currency. Yep. Do you see other countries doing that as well? Does that really happen though if the market if prices continue to stay the same, if not fall, over the next few months? Do you think that there'll be some reluctance, particularly given the volatility that we've seen over the past few months?
Correct, Lawrence. I think although the El Salvador news was one of the big bombshells of 2021, I expected the El Salvador news to create a lot of attention and discussion. Already, we've had a lot of countries that are dollarized or de facto dollarized, like Panama being a very good example, or other countries that are developing countries like Paraguay, for example, discussed potentially bringing on board, recognizing Bitcoin as legal tender. One thing I'll be watching, though, is other countries that are taking non-Bitcoin routes. For example, a good example is Palau, small island not far from Japan, where they're looking at issuing the first government-backed US dollar stablecoin. And other examples are not far from there, the Marshall Islands, where they're looking at issuing the first decentralized digital currency. So I think these are some of the things I'll be watching over the next couple of months. Whether there'll be another country recognize Bitcoin as legal tender, I would say it's potentially unlikely. However, whether we'll have other countries discuss this topic, that's something definitely I'll be watching. And let's not forget, there's not only an issue in emerging markets. A recent survey in the United States found that 27% of users in the US would be open to the idea of having Bitcoin as legal tender. So I think it's a broader discussion than just some dollarized or de facto dollarized countries or developing countries.
Well, in your article, you also mentioned that the IMF, the World Bank, which were created during the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, in which the US dollar was adopted as the global reserve currency, they've opposed El Salvador's move to make Bitcoin legal tender. So I was wondering if you could weigh in on that tension.
Yeah, it's been very interesting, as you mentioned. Obviously, perhaps not surprisingly, there was a lot of pushback from both the World Bank and the IMF. Like you mentioned, entities created during the Bretton Woods Summit, where the US dollar was used as the reserve currency of the world. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how these organizations, what the research they put out and what policy statements they make. Let's not forget, in many regards, a good example is the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, who I would argue 3-4 years ago was very anti-CBDC, and now was putting forward probably some of the best research in the world on the topic. The IMF, let's not forget, a couple of years ago, put forward some very interesting developments on CBDC. For example, on some of narrow banking type of models that we had for CBDCs. So I think some of these organizations, I think will be interesting to follow what work they put together. I think also from a policy perspective for other policymakers in various countries, the way that they've reacted to El Salvador, the way they reacted to the Marshall Islands is obviously something they're going to take in consideration, because obviously the IMF and the World Bank, whether we like it or not, still have a lot of say on, especially on some of these emerging countries.
Henri, just one last question before we wrap, but any price predictions for Bitcoin, ETH, or otherwise in 2022?
Well, you know what I'll tell you is, every year we ask our biggest hedge fund clients at PwC in a report we do with Elwood and AMA. And what was interesting actually on this point was that the consensus last year, the average price expectation that people had for December 31st was $100,000 for the price of Bitcoin. I'm sure if I ask them again, we're actually conducting the survey as we speak. I'm sure that the price target many will have will be as optimistic for the year to come. Again, I think a lot of people, whether they're institutional investors, retail investors, there's a lot of reasons to be structurally bullish, not only on Bitcoin, but the market at whole. And I think I expect that positive momentum to continue despite some of the headwinds we've had in recent weeks from that perspective.
Henri, one quick point I forgot to ask you. What's up with PwC taking up space in the metaverse in Sandbox? What's the deal with that?
Yeah, good question. As you mentioned on this point, Emily, we PwC Hong Kong recently announced the acquisition of land on the Sandbox metaverse. I think it's a very natural step for us. As you know, our purpose at PwC is to build trust in society and solve important problems, especially when it comes to building sustainable outcomes. As let's not forget, PwC Hong Kong, we were the first large professional firm to accept Bitcoin payment in 2017. We have now one of probably the largest crypto teams in the market. And I think it's very natural that as our clients, both financial services clients and others, are embarking on this NFT, DeFi, Web 3.0 metaverse journey, that we actually are there as well as their trusted partner. So I think it's a very natural move from our perspective to get involved in that land acquisition on the Sandbox. I'm very excited about it as well.
All right.